I don't set no, Phillips. These old methods of yours, they set are becoming a bit tired. We need something more modern. Adapt or die, right? I froze. The words hit like a slap in the face, sharper than I could have ever anticipated. Nathan, a kid barely in his 30s, standing there, dismissing everything I've spent the last 25 years building. His tone, casual, smug, like he was explaining something to a child. But there was no mistaking the venom in it. The way he mocked everything that had worked for me, everything I had believed in. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I couldn't react in the moment, not right away. The room felt small, too small for the weight of the betrayal hanging in the air. The younger executives in the room shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. They all seemed to agree with him. I stood there, locked in place, as Nathan's voice continued to pierce through the room. It's just not about loyalty anymore, Phillips, he added, like a final jab. It's just about adaptability, flexibility, and you chewed to stuck in the past. The silence after he spoke felt suffocating, almost as if the whole room had drawn in one collective breath, waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't find the words. How could I? What was there to say to someone who just told me everything I believed in was obsolete? The rest of the meeting went by in a blur. I didn't hear a word of what was said. All I could feel was that tight, suffocating knot in my chest. The weight of his words pressing down on me, pushing me into the corner of a room that used to feel like my domain. A few weeks later, it all came crashing down. Nathan didn't just challenge me with his words. He proved me wrong. He swooped in and secured the $50 million contract that I had spent months building. I was blindsided. I had been so sure, so confident, that the deal was mine. I had put everything into it. But Nathan, he didn't care about relationships. He didn't care about the details, the long-term strategy I had built. All he cared about was getting it done, fast, now, before anyone could stop him. And just like that, the deal I'd bled for was no longer mine. It wasn't just the $50 million that stung. It was the realization that Nathan had effectively replaced me. He had taken everything I had worked for, every value I held dear, and mocked them as if they didn't matter anymore. I wasn't just losing a contract. I was losing my place in the company, my respect, my entire identity. I walked out of that meeting feeling like a man who had just been buried alive. No one even looked my way. They all congratulated Nathan, congratulated him for being the future of the company, while I stood there invisible, a relic, outdated. I came home that night to Marie and Ellie, expecting to find some peace, but there was no escape. Marie looked up from the kitchen, her face immediately changing when she saw me. She could tell without a word what had happened. The disappointment in her eyes hit me harder than any confrontation ever could. Phillips, what's wrong? Her voice was soft, gentle, but I could feel the weight behind it, the unspoken question. The question I didn't want to answer. I sat down at the kitchen table, unable to meet her eyes. Nothing, I said, my voice hollow. It sets fine. But it wasn't set fine. It was far from fine. Marie sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine, but I could feel the distance between us growing. The silent tension between us, the way she kept glancing at me, waiting for me to say something, to explain. She didn't have to say it. I could see it in her eyes. You said given everything to this job, Phillips. What about us? Her words cut deep, and I didn't know how to respond. What was there to say? She was right. I had spent so many years chasing success, pushing for the next deal, for the next win. I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I gave everything to the company, it would all pay off. But it didn't. I looked at her, finally meeting her eyes. The disappointment, the hurt, it was all there. ISEF tried for us, for our future. But it wasn't set enough. Not anymore. I sat there in silence, letting her words hang in the air. The truth was clear now. I had sacrificed everything. My family, my values, my peace, for a job that didn't care about me. And now, I was losing everything that mattered. As the evening wore on, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Nathan thought he had won. He thought he could tear down everything I had built. But I wasn't going to let him take my legacy without a fight. It was time to make him regret underestimating me. Time to prove that old methods built on integrity and relationships still had a place in this world, and I'd show them all that I wasn't ready to fade away just yet. The days after Nathan's victory blurred into one long stretch of silence. I couldn't shake the feeling of his words echoing in my head, as if they were etched into my soul. Old methods, tired, adapt, or die. I could still hear them, clear as day, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. I tried to push through it. I kept showing up to work, sitting at my desk, answering emails, attending meetings. But it was all just a shell. I wasn't really there anymore. I couldn't concentrate. Every time I looked at the contract Nathan had secured, I felt like I was suffocating. He had taken everything, my deal, my confidence, my belief in what I was doing. I tried to speak to Marie to explain what was going on inside my head, but she could see it, the way I was withdrawing, the way I wasn't really present. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just numb. One night, when I couldn't sleep again, I found myself walking through the darkened halls of the office, the building eerily quiet. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the empty corridors, my mind racing with everything I'd lost. I came across two junior employees in the break room. They didn't notice me at first, too busy talking. But when I overheard their conversation, I stopped dead in my tracks. "I miss the old ways," one of them said. "You know, the personal touch, the way Phillips used to handle things. It just felt more real." The other one laughed softly. "Yeah, I know what you mean. It steps all so fast now. Just numbers on a page. No one talks to you anymore." I felt something stir inside me. A flicker of hope, maybe? Or was it just recognition of what I had been fighting for all along? I wasn't sure, but it made me pause, made me rethink everything Nathan had said. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for a deal or for the company's future. I was fighting for something deeper, something I had lost sight of in the race to prove myself. I left the office that night feeling different, not necessarily better, but with a sense of clarity that had been missing for weeks. Maybe I hadn't lost everything. Maybe I still had a chance to prove that the methods I believed in weren't just old-fashioned. Maybe they were what the company really needed. When I got home, Marie was already in bed. Ellie was asleep in her room. The house felt emptier than usual. I stood in the doorway for a while, just listening to the quiet. I didn't know where to begin, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let this defeat define me. I had a plan now. It wasn't about rushing in, fighting fire with fire. It was about reclaiming what was mine, slowly, methodically. I wasn't going to let Nathan's arrogance take me down. I knew I had to rebuild, not just my career, but my life. The first step, it wasn't about dealing with Nathan. It wasn't even about the $50 million deal. It was about understanding why I had let everything slip away in the first place. I had let my work consume me, and in the process I had lost myself. But not anymore. I wasn't going to let that happen again. It was time to reestablish the boundaries, not just at work, but with my family too. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside me, but this time I wasn't lost. I knew where I needed to go. I knew what I needed to do. I had a second chance. I wasn't going to waste it. The world hadn't changed, not really. It was still the same fast-paced, cutthroat environment that had always existed. But now I had a new perspective. I wasn't going to rush in and make reckless moves. I wasn't going to let my emotions rule me. This time I was going to be methodical, strategic. I had something to prove, not to Nathan, but to myself. It started with the people I trusted, the ones who had worked with me for years and understood what my methods were really about. I made a few calls, set up some discreet meetings. One by one, I reconnected with former colleagues, mentors, and clients who had always believed in my approach. It was strange, almost like waking up from a long sleep. Suddenly, I felt a surge of purpose again. The first meeting was with John Patel, a client I had worked closely with over the years. He had always been the kind of client who valued relationships, who appreciated the human touch, the long-term commitment. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but when I called, he picked up immediately. "Phillips," he said, his voice warm. "What decept's going on? Haven't heard from you in a while." I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. I've been busy, John, but I think it's time to talk again about the way things are done around here. He didn't ask for details. He just listened, and that, I realized, was the value of the relationships I had built. People didn't just trust me for my business acumen. They trusted me because they knew I cared. I wasn't just another guy trying to close a deal. I was someone they could count on. As I went through my old files, going over the documents and contracts Nathan had secured, I started to see the cracks. Nathan's aggressive, numbers-driven approach hadn't accounted for all the nuances. There were miscalculations, assumptions he had made that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The more I dug, the more I found. The $50 million deal wasn't as solid as Nathan had made it out to be. I didn't confront him directly. I didn't have to. I was playing the long game. I knew if I acted too soon, I would be exposed. So I kept it quiet. I started collecting evidence. Emails, receipts, meeting notes, all the little details Nathan had overlooked. It wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about showing that my methods were not only valid but superior. I reached out to a retired industry veteran, someone I had worked with in the past, a man who understood the complexities of navigating corporate bureaucracy. He became my guide, helping me understand the legal ins and outs of the situation. I knew the fight would take time, but I wasn't in a rush. The world wasn't moving as fast as Nathan thought. It was moving at my pace now. By the end of the week, I had what I needed, the pieces to the puzzle. It wasn't just about Nathan's mistakes. It was about building a case that proved the value of what I had always done. Slowly, methodically, I was setting the stage for something bigger. The foundation was laid, and soon enough, the $50 million deal wouldn't just be Nathan's anymore. It was going to be mine, but I wasn't going to stop there. This was bigger than one contract. This was about reclaiming my place in the company, about showing everyone that experience, integrity, and relationships were worth more than empty promises and flashy tactics. The plan was set. I wasn't going to confront Nathan head on. That would have been too easy, too predictable. No, I was going to let him think everything was fine. Let him believe he had won, that he was in control. I'd let him enjoy his moment of glory. But in the meantime, I was doing the work, quietly, carefully. At the next leadership meeting, I stayed calm, collected, asking the questions Nathan couldn't answer. I let him fumble, trying to cover up the holes in his perfect deal. It was subtle at first, just a question here, a suggestion there, but slowly I could see the cracks begin to form. Nathan wasn't as confident as he had been just weeks before. He started avoiding my gaze during meetings, and I noticed the others in the room, the ones who used to hang on every word he said, beginning to shift their attention back to me. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the issues with Nathan's approach. I spoke with a few trusted colleagues and clients who had been alienated by his get-it-done-now mentality. I listened to their frustrations, took note of every missed detail, every broken promise. They appreciated my patience, my willingness to listen. I wasn't trying to fix everything all at once. I didn't want to seem like I was trying to reclaim the $50 million deal in a single stroke. No, this was a war of attrition. The first step was planting seeds of doubt, making Nathan's arrogance seem reckless in the eyes of the leadership team. The second was to ensure that my reputation, my values were reestablished in their minds. One morning, as I sat with John Patel in his office, we discussed the deal in more depth. He had concerns about Nathan's handling of some of the smaller clients, especially the ones who had been with the company for years. He expressed his appreciation for my approach, for the personal relationships I built. I could see that he was still hesitant about moving forward with Nathan's aggressive terms. "I'm not sure about this new direction," he said, leaning in a little closer. "It feels impersonal. I always liked the way you handled things, Phillips. There's something real about it, something trustworthy." I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. This was the ammunition I needed. I wasn't going to rush him, though. I wanted to keep the pressure low. I let him talk, reassured him that I was still available, still ready to work with him in the future. But deep down, I knew I was laying the groundwork for something bigger. With every conversation, with every little piece of doubt I planted, I could feel Nathan's hold on the company weakening. The board was starting to question his methods. And when that moment came, when they finally saw the cracks in his shiny facade, I would be there, ready to step in. Nathan was still too confident in his ability to control the narrative. He believed his charm and fast-paced approach would win over everyone. But what he didn't realize was that people remembered how they were treated. They remembered the way I treated them, with respect, patience, and care. They remembered the relationships I had built over decades. Relationships Nathan hadn't even considered. The walls around Nathan's success were crumbling, and I was standing just outside, watching, waiting. Soon the truth would come crashing down, and Nathan would realize that the world he thought he had conquered was not built on the shaky ground of arrogance. It was built on trust, on loyalty, on the very things he had dismissed as old-fashioned. And when that day came, I would be there ready to reclaim what was mine. But I wasn't just fighting for the $50 million. I was fighting for my legacy, for everything I had built, and for the future that I wasn't going to let Nathan take from me. The plan was set. I wasn't going to confront Nathan head on. That would have been too easy, too predictable. No, I was going to let him think everything was fine. Let him believe he had won, that he was in control. I'd let him enjoy his moment of glory. But in the meantime, I was doing the work, quietly, carefully. At the next leadership meeting, I stayed calm, collected, asking the questions Nathan couldn't answer. I let him fumble, trying to cover up the holes in his perfect deal. It was subtle at first, just a question here, a suggestion there. But slowly, I could see the cracks begin to form. Nathan wasn't as confident as he had been just weeks before. He started avoiding my gaze during meetings. And I noticed the others in the room, the ones who used to hang on every word he said, beginning to shift their attention back to me. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the issues with Nathan's approach. I spoke with a few trusted colleagues and clients who had been alienated by his get-it-done-now mentality. I listened to their frustrations, took note of every missed detail, every broken promise. They appreciated my patience, my willingness to listen. I wasn't trying to fix everything all at once. I didn't want to seem like I was trying to reclaim the $50 million deal in a single stroke. No, this was a war of attrition. The first step was planting seeds of doubt, making Nathan's arrogance seem reckless in the eyes of the leadership team. The second was to ensure that my reputation, my values were reestablished in their minds. One morning, as I sat with John Patel in his office, we discussed the deal in more depth. He had concerns about Nathan's handling of some of the smaller clients, especially the ones who had been with the company for years. He expressed his appreciation for my approach, for the personal relationships I built. I could see that he was still hesitant about moving forward with Nathan's aggressive terms. "I'm not sure about this new direction," he said, leaning in a little closer. "It feels impersonal. I always liked the way you handled things, Phillips. There's something real about it, something trustworthy." I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. This was the ammunition I needed. I wasn't going to rush him, though. I wanted to keep the pressure low. I let him talk, reassured him that I was still available, still ready to work with him in the future. But deep down, I knew I was laying the groundwork for something bigger. With every conversation, with every little piece of doubt I planted, I could feel Nathan's hold on the company weakening. The board was starting to question his methods. And when that moment came, when they finally saw the cracks in his shiny facade, I would be there ready to step in. Nathan was still too confident in his ability to control the narrative. He believed his charm and fast-paced approach would win over everyone. But what he didn't realize was that people remembered how they were treated. They remembered the way I treated them, with respect, patience, and care. They remembered the relationships I had built over decades, relationships Nathan hadn't even considered. The walls around Nathan's success were crumbling, and I was standing just outside, watching, waiting. Soon the truth would come crashing down, and Nathan would realize that the world he thought he had conquered was not built on the shaky ground of arrogance. It was built on trust, on loyalty, on the very things he had dismissed as old-fashioned. And when that day came, I would be there, ready to reclaim what was mine. But I wasn't just fighting for the $50 million. I was fighting for my legacy, for everything I had built, and for the future that I wasn't going to let Nathan take from me. The pieces were falling into place. I could feel it, the tension in the air, the subtle shift in how Nathan was being perceived. His bravado was starting to crack, and I wasn't even the one delivering the blow. His own actions were betraying him, his overconfidence slowly turning into paranoia. It was time to turn up the pressure. I wasn't going to expose him all at once. I wasn't in a rush. I had learned that the best way to win wasn't by charging in head first, but by patiently laying out the truth, piece by piece, until there was no way for him to hide. I had my allies now, those who still believed in my way of doing business, the ones who understood the importance of relationships, of trust. Slowly I started bringing them into the fold, gathering all the evidence I could find, emails, contracts, even the recorded phone calls where Nathan had made promises he couldn't keep. Every conversation I had, every step I took was a calculated move. The key piece of the puzzle came one afternoon, when I was reviewing some of the financial projections Nathan had made for the $50 million deal. I had already suspected something was off, but it wasn't until I dug deeper that I uncovered the truth. Mistakes, gross overestimations, and mismanagement of resources that could have easily derailed the entire project. It wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a series of glaring errors, all hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the experience to spot them. I started putting everything together, organizing the findings into a clear case. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to go running to the board with a pile of papers. No, I was going to present this methodically, one piece at a time, until Nathan had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. I reached out to a few key clients who had been affected by Nathan's reckless handling. One of them, a longtime partner, had been furious about the aggressive tactics Nathan had used, which had driven away several smaller clients. I called him up and we met in person. As we sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant, he told me everything: how Nathan's promises had been hollow, how his approach had alienated the people who mattered most. "I don't know if he Sips got the right vision," the client admitted, frustration evident in his voice. "He Sips so caught up in the rush. He Sips lost sight of what matters. You were different, Phillips. You always took the time to understand the bigger picture." I let the words sink in. Every one of them was a strike against Nathan, and I wasn't about to let them go to waste. I wasn't going to ask for the deal back, not yet. I knew that would make me look desperate. Instead, I simply listened, gathering every bit of evidence I could. In that moment, it wasn't about proving that Nathan had messed up. It was about reminding the people around me of why I was still the right choice. The next step was delicate. I didn't want to go behind Nathan's back and ruin him entirely. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to make sure everyone knew he wasn't the right fit for the job. I knew exactly how to expose his flaws without ever having to say a word. I started to ask the hard questions in meetings, the ones I knew Nathan couldn't answer. I pushed him softly at first, probing at his shaky projections, his rush strategies. His confidence started to slip, and it didn't take long for the others in the room to notice. By the time the board meeting rolled around, I was ready. I had everything lined up: the evidence, the testimonies, the strategy. I didn't need to tear Nathan apart in front of everyone. No, I just needed to make them see what I had already seen. Nathan's approach was all flash and no substance. I wasn't the only one who had doubts anymore. The board was starting to ask the questions I had planted. They were beginning to see the cracks in Nathan's armor, and while Nathan still walked around with that same smug smile, I could tell it was starting to fade. He wasn't as confident as he used to be. He was looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next move, wondering who was going to turn on him first. He had no idea. But I did, and soon enough the truth was going to come crashing down on him. The pressure was mounting. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. Nathan was cracking, and it was becoming more apparent with every passing day. The once confident young executive was now stumbling, his charm losing its shine. His arrogance had been his greatest asset, but now it was his greatest weakness. The cracks in his performance were too obvious for anyone to ignore. I watched him at the next leadership meeting, his face tight with anxiety. He tried to laugh it off, tried to smile and offer his usual bravado, but I could see it, the doubt creeping into his eyes. The way he stammered when asked about the $50 million deal, the very deal he had secured with so much confidence, his over-reliance on speed and numbers was beginning to show its consequences, and I wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. I knew he was feeling cornered. He had to be. The board was growing more skeptical, and the clients I had spoken with weren't exactly keeping quiet. Nathan had underestimated the loyalty people had for the old ways, for the personal touch that I had always offered. He had assumed that in this fast-paced world, relationships didn't matter, but he was wrong. As the days wore on, Nathan began making mistakes. Small ones at first, things he could cover up with a slick presentation or a smooth response. But the pressure was building, and eventually the cracks became impossible to hide. He started making excuses in meetings, avoiding calls, even showing up late to important client negotiations. His confidence was slipping, and I could see the strain on his face. One afternoon, during a particularly heated board discussion, Nathan snapped. He accused me of trying to sabotage his success, of undermining him at every turn. The room fell silent. It was like a breath had been held by everyone, waiting for what would come next. His anger was palpable, his voice rising with every word, but I remained calm, my expression neutral. I didn't react. I didn't need to. Nathan, I said, quietly, my voice cutting through the tension, if you sep going to accuse me of something, at least make sure it sep's something worth accusing. A step, not the one running around making promises I can sep keep. I let the words hang in the air, knowing that they had landed where they needed to. I wasn't going to let him bait me. I wasn't going to lose my cool, but the others, the board members, the investors, they were listening. They were seeing what I had already known. Nathan wasn't the right person for this job. He stood there for a moment, his face flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. I could feel his fury in the room, but I didn't let it affect me. This was his downfall, not mine. It was clear that Nathan's nerves were getting the best of him, and as the meeting ended, I could see the doubt in the eyes of the board members. They were no longer just questioning his methods, they were questioning his ability to lead. I left the meeting with a quiet sense of satisfaction. I had planted the seed of doubt, and now all I had to do was wait. Nathan was digging his own grave. His insecurity was becoming too obvious, his flaws too glaring to ignore. His overconfidence was now his greatest enemy, and it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake too big to cover up. I didn't need to push him any further. He was falling apart on his own. The game was almost over. All I had to do was sit back and watch the inevitable collapse. But there was one final thing I needed to do, one last step to make sure that when the time came, I was in the perfect position to take control. I had already prepared the final pieces of the puzzle, the evidence, the records, the conversations, and soon I would be ready to present it all. Nathan wouldn't see it coming, but when it hit, it would hit hard. The boardroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. I had waited for this moment, planned for it meticulously, and now everything was in place. Nathan sat across from me, trying to maintain his usual cocky demeanor, but I could see the cracks in his facade, the sweat on his brow, the way he kept glancing nervously at the clock, as if hoping this meeting would be over before the inevitable came. The board members were divided, unsure of which direction to take. Some of them were still loyal to Nathan, blinded by his speed and ambition, but the others, they were starting to see the truth. The way his aggressive tactics had alienated clients, the miscalculations in the $50 million deal, the lies he had fed them. The evidence was all there, and it was just a matter of time before it all came crashing down. I leaned forward, feeling the weight of the moment. I had prepared for this. I had all the facts, all the proof I needed to expose Nathan for what he truly was. A young executive with no respect for the legacy built before him, no understanding of the foundation that had made the company what it was. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room, I said, my voice calm, steady. The room went silent. All eyes turned toward me. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I pulled out a folder filled with documents, emails, and contracts. I laid them out one by one in front of the board, each piece a damning indictment of Nathan's handling of the $50 million deal. I didn't need to explain it. The evidence spoke for itself. the overinflated projections, the mismanagement of client relations, the promises he couldn't deliver on. And then I dropped the bombshell. I clicked play on a recording I had obtained from a confidential source. It was a phone conversation between Nathan and a client, one where he openly admitted to rushing through key details of the deal to close it faster. His voice was clear on the recording, his arrogance spilling over as he bragged about cutting corners to secure the contract. The room went silent, the tension palpable. I glanced at Nathan, who was now visibly sweating, his face pale. He shifted in his seat, trying to keep his composure, but I could see the panic in his eyes. The truth was out. He had nowhere to hide. "Nathan," I said, my voice steady but carrying a weight of finality, "you've been running this company with one goal in mind, to prove that you're better than me. But in doing so, you've alienated clients, ruined relationships, and mismanaged the very deal you're so proud of. This company was built on trust. You've destroyed that." Nathan opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered. He tried to defend himself, tried to explain away his mistakes, but it was too late. The board had seen enough. I turned to the board members, one by one. "You cisfered the facts. You cisfered the recording. The question is, can you trust someone who's willing to cut corners for the sake of their ego?" There was a moment of silence, the kind that feels like an eternity. I knew what was coming. I had planned it all along, and then, one by one, the board members started to speak up. Their voices hesitant at first, but growing more confident as they laid the truth bare. "We can move forward with someone like this," one of them said. "We need someone who understands the value of relationships, who knows the long game, not just the quick wins." Another added, "Phillips has always been the one we could trust. Nathan, he's shown us what happens when you chase the quick fix." I looked over at Nathan, who now looked like a man on the verge of a breakdown. He had lost control. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. The final blow came when the client, the one who had been wavering, spoke up. "We decided to move forward with Phillips's proposal," they said. "We believe in the long-term vision. We believe in integrity." And just like that, it was over. The $50 million deal was mine, not because I fought for it in the traditional sense, but because I had played the game the way it was meant to be played, with patience, with integrity, and with a deep understanding of what mattered. Nathan sat there, his career unraveling in front of him, his reputation shattered in an instant. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth had caught up to him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I stood up, gathering my papers. The room was still silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. But I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I had won, and not just the deal. I had proven that the old ways, done with integrity, were still the best ways. As I walked out of the boardroom, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had reclaimed what was mine, and in doing so, I had restored my dignity, my reputation, and my legacy. The world hadn't passed me by. It had been waiting for me to prove that it hadn't. It didn't take long for the fallout to set in. The deal was mine, sure, but the consequences of Nathan's fall from grace were immediate and harsh. The company, which had once been filled with a certain air of confidence, now felt rattled. Nathan's downfall sent ripples through the entire organization. He had built his career on the idea that he could outsmart everyone, that speed and aggression would take him to the top. But in the end, it was his lack of foresight, his carelessness that brought him down. Nathan was still in denial. I could see it when we passed each other in the hallways, the way he held his head high, tried to project the same arrogance he had before, even as the walls closed in around him. But his position was fragile. The board, the clients, even the employees, they had all begun to question his leadership. The cracks were visible to everyone but him. He called me into his office one afternoon. I could see the desperation in his eyes as he tried to regain control, tried to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. He sat behind his desk, his hands trembling as he leaned forward, trying to maintain his composure. "You had no right to do this," he spat. "You took everything from me. I was supposed to be the future of this company. You ruined that." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I just looked at him, letting the silence stretch between us. There was no need for a response. He knew it. I knew it. And deep down, I think he knew I had won. Not just the deal, but the war. He had been blinded by his own ambition, and now he was paying the price for it. You never understood the value of trust, Nathan, I said, my voice steady but cutting. You thought you could force your way to the top, but you never bothered to build anything lasting. Now look where you are. His face flushed with anger, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. The truth had hit him too hard. As I turned to leave his office, I heard him call out after me, his voice shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Nathan had already given up everything, his integrity, his respect, his future, and in the end he had nothing left to fight for. The next few days were filled with meetings. The board wanted reassurance that this wouldn't happen again. They wanted to know how we would move forward, but the truth was they had already made their decision. They saw the value in what I had to offer, not just in terms of deals and contracts, but in the culture I had cultivated over the years. I wasn't just a businessman. I was a man who understood that success wasn't built on numbers alone. It was built on relationships, on trust, and on the belief that doing things the right way would always pay off in the end. By the time I walked out of the final meeting, everything had changed. Nathan had been quietly removed from his position, his reputation in tatters. His ambition had been his downfall. And in his place I stood, not because I had wanted his job, but because I had earned it. The company was now in a transition phase. The next steps would be crucial. I had regained my position, but I had learned something important in the process. Success wasn't just about the deal you closed. It was about the people you helped, the integrity you maintained, and the trust you built along the way. As I walked out of the office building, the crisp air of the city greeted me. It was almost like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Nathan's shadow no longer loomed over me. The past had been put to rest, and now it was time for me to move forward. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected. The realization that this wasn't just about the company. It was about my family, my values, and the man I had become through this whole ordeal. I hadn't just reclaimed a deal. I had reclaimed myself. And that was the real victory. It was over. Nathan's career was in ruins, the company was moving forward, and I had reclaimed everything I thought I'd lost. But even now, as I sat back in my office, my feet on the desk, watching the skyline through the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering. Maybe it was the weight of what I had to sacrifice to get here, or maybe it was the way I had allowed myself to be consumed by the need for revenge. But as I thought back on everything, the betrayal, the months of planning, the sleepless nights, I realized one thing: it wasn't about getting even. It wasn't even about Nathan. It was about reclaiming my place in the world, proving to myself that I hadn't been left behind, that the values I held on to, trust, integrity, relationships, still meant something in a world that was constantly changing. I had made my mark. I had shown that the old ways still had a place in this modern world, where everyone seemed to be rushing ahead, leaving behind anything that couldn't keep up. But what they didn't realize was that they were building their castles on sand, while I was building mine on rock. The next few weeks were filled with congratulations. The board was thrilled with the outcome. Clients came back, and the confidence in my leadership was restored. But none of it meant as much as the quiet moments at home. The times when I sat across from Marie and Ellie, when they looked at me with respect and love, things I thought I had lost. Marie, who had once questioned my choices, now seemed proud of me, proud of the man I had become, not just as an executive, but as a father and a husband. Ellie, who had grown distant during those long years of my obsession with work, was now more present, more engaged. She had her father back, and that was worth everything. Nathan's name faded from the conversations at the office, but his downfall had left a mark. People were talking now not about the deal, but about what it meant, about how the right way was still the best way. Justice, in the end, wasn't about making Nathan suffer. It wasn't about watching him lose everything. It was about proving that integrity would always rise to the top, that even in a world that was obsessed with speed and numbers, there was still room for patience, for hard work, for real relationships. I had walked a long, hard road to get here, and there were days when I didn't know if I could make it, but now, as I sat in the office watching the sun set over the city, I knew that everything had been worth it. I had gotten back my place in the company, but more importantly, I had gotten back my peace of mind. I had won, not because I had taken everything from Nathan, but because I had proven to myself that I didn't need to lose myself in the process. And that, more than any deal or victory, was the true justice. The weeks that followed Nathan's departure from the company were filled with quiet reflection. As I moved through my day-to-day responsibilities, the weight of what had happened, the betrayal, the planning, the methodical revenge, began to settle into something that felt almost like a distant memory. But I knew deep down that the lessons I'd learned, the man I had become through this whole ordeal, would stick with me forever. I couldn't help but think about how different things were now. The office, the company, even the boardroom felt like a completely different world. Nathan had been replaced, but more than that, his methods had been exposed for what they truly were: hollow, empty, built on a foundation that could never stand. And in the process, I had reclaimed my place. I had reclaimed my confidence, but the greatest victory wasn't the $50 million deal or the respect I had won back from my peers. No, the greatest victory was the realization that I could walk away from all of it, unscathed, and still be proud of who I was. I stood at my desk one afternoon looking out over the city as the sun dipped below the skyline. I thought back to the moment when I first walked into that boardroom facing Nathan and the board, knowing that everything had come to a head. Back then, I had been driven by anger, by a desire to prove that I wasn't obsolete, that my methods had value. But now, as I stood there, I realized it wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I hadn't lost my way, that the things I valued, loyalty, trust, relationships, still had a place in this fast-paced, ever-changing world. Marie and Ellie were at dinner, laughing and talking about their day, and for the first time in a long while I felt like I was truly present. Not just as a father or a husband, but as a man who had fought for something he believed in, and who had won not because of brute force, but because he stayed true to himself. As I sat down with them, I realized that the real prize wasn't the company's future, or even the deal itself. The real prize was the respect I had earned from the people who mattered most to me. I had almost lost them, almost sacrificed everything for the sake of success. But I had found a way to balance the two. I had learned that success wasn't about sacrificing who you were for the sake of progress. It was about staying grounded even as the world around you changed. And I had done that. I had stayed grounded, and in the end, that's what mattered most. Nathan had thought that his ambition, his willingness to crush anyone in his path, would lead him to the top. But in the end, it was his lack of integrity that brought him down. It was his inability to see the value in relationships, in trust, in doing things the right way that led to his downfall. I had won, not because I was better than Nathan, but because I had never lost sight of what truly mattered. As I walked out of the office that night, the city lights twinkling in the distance, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I had proven my point, but more importantly, I had proven something to myself. No matter how much the world changes, no matter how much I'm tempted to lose myself in the race to succeed, I will never sacrifice the values that have made me who I am. The world may be moving faster, but I am not in a rush to catch up. And that is the true victory.